Hey gamers, Maniac here with GameAccess.net. Welcome to back to my arcade. It's been a while since we've been down here, but for this particular Memories of Maniac, I wanted to have kind of a cool ambiance in the background for when I was talking about this subject matter. You guys know that the heaviest inspiration that I've had, whether it be for my website style, whether it be for what I've talked about, in these games, I always seem to resonate most with the late 80s, early 90s cyberpunk aesthetic. That is something that means a lot to me. I grew up with that aesthetic. I always envied that aesthetic, and I've always eh, with the games that I grew up with were always heavily inspired by those aesthetics. And of course, I don't ask me why, but I always just loved movies like um, The Matrix, Johnny Mnemonic, and then later on, when I saw the original Ghost in the Shell, that completely resonated with me like almost perfectly. To say nothing of like games like a series like Dot Hack and stuff like that. So I want you guys to know where I was coming from, and probably within the past decade, my original interests in like action first person shooters and mature shooter games has kind of shifted to more role playing games, JRPGs specifically, or console role playing games. Um, I actually fell in love, or rediscovered, I should say, Final Fantasy games, Dragon Quest games, and I've been having a lot of fun going back through their history and learning more about their history. And of course, that goes back into the history of Japan. But this particular video is an homage to a particular game. And unfortunately, it's a game that nobody can get anymore. Now, part of what started this resonance is probably, or at least a good component of it, was a fondness for Nintendo. And in late 2012, I decided that I was willing to take a chance on Nintendo specifically. That I had a lot of fondness for Nintendo. The first console, the first games I ever played, the first game I ever played was Super Mario Brothers, and then of course Duck Hunt was the second game I ever played. Um, However, I moved on after the NES generation, and almost exclusively after that, for at least a good decade at least, I was exclusively on PC and playing PC games. And I later, when I tried to expand out, one of the first, to console games specifically, one of the first consoles I thought of was the GameCube, because I thought to myself, well, I've already got a high-end PC, which I did at the time, so I can play all of these PC games, and most multi-platform games are going to come to PC, so I'm just going to play those on PC. Obviously, when Grand Theft Auto 3 came out, Vice City, I played all the PC versions of those games. When Halo first came out, I played the PC version of it. But the console that seems to be out on the market right now with the best chance of having the exclusives that I can't get elsewhere seems to be the GameCube. So I'll pick up a GameCube. And I did. And I freaking love the GameCube. But the GameCube didn't have a very long lifespan, unfortunately. It had a lot of really great exclusives like Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, or just Metroid Prime, of course. When I say, of course, Metroid Prime, Paper Mario: Thousand Year Door, Metroid Prime 2, Rogue Squadron 2, Rogue Squadron 3. I mean, you couldn't get those games elsewhere, at least not at the time, certainly. And I was so excited to be able to actually play them, and I was charmed by the interactivity with the Nintendo Game Boy, even though a Game Boy Advance that I didn't have. But I was impressed by just what this console from Japan was capable of. And I remember doing a lot of research after the fact, looking back on what what did Nintendo accomplish that I didn't know about? Not because because it never came here. It never came to the United States. And even though I had internet access, of course, information out that time was not really heavily talked about. And it turned out that Nintendo had made a lot of huge strides, and had Sony, but just a lot of huge strides that really, as far as I was concerned, never came to the United States. And it was such a shame. It actually, if anything, made the United States, it was humiliating to not have to get these things specifically, almost people in the States, I should say. And I'll just give a couple of great examples that I thought was like, wow, they did that then. Most people don't know. I mean, nowadays we take this for granted. If I take my car out for a drive, I get satellite radio. And there are plenty of homes right now, as you guys are watching this video, that have digital satellite antenna, broadcasting dishes on their roofs. And with those roofs, they can get satellite TV, HD TV, a bit broadcast via satellite content, as well as, I'm sure, satellite radio, as well, depending upon what you guys choose to have. It's all paid services, premium services here. But of course, but that's all possible, certainly. And I became aware of those types of services again in the late 90s, early 2000s, early aughts. And I didn't think anything of it until, of course, I found out that there were satellite radio services almost equivalent in capability to the kind of stuff that we have nowadays. I mean, let me just break it down for you guys. Let's say, for example, you guys have a home. You guys have home television, basically. Most cases, what you're going to have is you're going to have some kind of signal coming in. Either it's from fiber optic, satellite dish, or from the coaxial cable connection coming in from cable TV. But that's a digital signal. So in all likelihood, you've got some type of digital converter box plugged into your TV or your modem, basically, so that you can actually decode the signals and watch them on your television or use them for the internet. We take that kind of stuff for granted. I remember that stuff starting to become a thing probably around, the earliest would be like the year 2000. And it really didn't start taking off as far as I was concerned, at least not into the United States, until about 2002, 2003. By 2004, it was pretty much everywhere. And then by about 2007, they started offering HD with it. And then as time has gone on and on, it's basically just been, we're just adding more channels and that sort of thing. But it's still pretty much based on that kind of stuff. Turns out that Japan had that in the early 90s. In fact, they actually used it for more than just satellite radio, although that was certainly possible. You could actually get through Japanese services like St. Giga. You could actually get 3-channel PCM signals coming in over the satellite dish, brought in as a linear PCM signal, decoded by a digital decoder box, no different than the one that you have that we use these days. And then that could be plugged into like your television or your home stereo or something like that. And you'll be able to listen to your music, but also you'll be able to play games with it, because those linear digital bits that would go through the satellite, if decoded properly, could actually offer game code that could be read by a Super Nintendo that had the proper expansion cards and plugged into it. Essentially, Nintendo had a Satellaview service, what they called the Satellaview service. And with it, you could actually, in the very early 90s, play Super Nintendo games over satellite that would be downloaded into your satellite dish. It wouldn't be bi-directional. You couldn't play it online multiplayer. But if you turned on your Super Nintendo at a certain time that they were doing the broadcast, you would actually get a portion of like a Legend of Zelda game or something that you could actually play alongside everybody else that was playing at that time. Talk about scheduled gaming nights. I mean, that, and of course, you'd get a TV guide or something in the mail that would tell you. That to me was seriously, like, you guys had that? I just, that blew my mind to find out that you guys had that in the early 90s. And then, of course, more recently, there was other stuff like, again, fast forward about 7, 8 years later, you get into around the year 2000, 2001. Even over here, you had this huge craze for digital pet games. Particularly, most people probably remember Tamagotchi. Now, Tamagotchi, it was basically just that. It was a digital pet game, and it had a small, like 8x8, pixel screen basically, and it would have a couple simple interface buttons, like a up down, like let's say 3 or 4 interface buttons. But it was enough that you could actually use it to manipulate a small, simple game on the screen so that you could take care of a virtual pet. And as time went on, they actually offered, other things like infrared transmitters so that you could actually swap data with other people that had similar games. And just the list went on from there. And over here, that kind of technology did take off, but they didn't go too crazy with it, at least not over here. Over here, we had the Tamagotchis, we had the ability to play around with them, and then there was some other stuff like Nintendo did, like the Pocket Pikachu the console, which is like a little Tamagotchi that had like interchangeable games and stuff like that. But most people just treated it as if it was like a little Tamagotchi, nothing too crazy, because of course at the same time the Game Boy was out and the Game Boy Color were out, so people just simply would have Game Boy Colors, and those were great. People loved them. And that was like the perfect thing to play Pokemon Yellow or Pokemon Gold and Silver on at that time. But in Japan, major companies like Sony were looking at that type of capabilities and almost thinking like, well, what can we do to actually use this in actual gaming hardware? And I always was fascinated by the concept of what this possibility was. Like, part to me of part of the idea of cyberpunk, or the idea of aesthetic, is that a person is going to be living their life, but they're also going to be playing their game. Like, imagine the game is your life, basically. You don't always go, be at home. You don't always be at work. You don't always be driving. But you're going to be shifting from spot to spot to spot to spot. That's life. That's what people do. And I was always fascinated by the way of, obviously, you get home, you can turn on your PC, you could turn on your console, you could turn on your television, whatever, you could play your game. But when your time is up, because you got to go to school, you got to go to work, you got to go eat, you got to pause your game or save your game, and that's it. Your game is done. At least it was in the early game, for early gaming. You could only play for as long as you could play. Obviously, like I said, there could be saves, but you could only play for that long. But I thought to myself, what if I could take a portion of my game that can continue running while I was not playing, or at least not while I was at my computer? And then Sony came out with an idea called the Pocket Station, which, as far as I know, was just incredibly popular in Japan. Never came over here. Sony, when they released the first PlayStation, revolutionized the concept of a memory card, in which that, yes, you would have a game, and you would be able to save with it, but you wouldn't save your game directly into the game itself, because it's a CD. There's no writable storage on a CD, at least not those types of CDs. So if you're going to save your progress, it's either got to be saved into the console's memory directly, and memory was volatile at the time, at least that kind of memory. Trust me, ask anybody that had I think it was like a Sega Saturn or something. They had those CMOS batteries that would keep memory, but if that battery ran out, and you replaced it, your data was gone. But Sony had something called the memory card, which is exactly what it sounds like. You would stick a memory card into your PlayStation at the same, in the slot just above your controller port. And instead of saving directly to the console, which you could not do, if you had to save, you would just simply tell it to save to your game controller, your memory card. And the best part is that since that card was interchangeable, you could basically pull it out and you can put a different card in if you ran out of space or you had other games you were playing and you ran out of memory on that one. Because of course memory was still finite and games would take up predictable amounts of storage. So you could use up a whole card essentially. Just by playing a few games and wanting to keep those saves. Of course, you could transfer and copy saves, but that's another story. You would still need a second one. But also you could bring your card over to your buddy's house. And that was just almost revolutionary, that if your buddy had a PlayStation, you wouldn't have to bring your PlayStation to their house. If your buddy had a copy of the game, then you wouldn't have to bring the game over, although you could if you didn't. But you could bring your memory card over, have all your game data, and just pick up where you left off over at your buddy's house. This was a big deal. But of course, that came here. You guys are all aware of that. And of course, later it got replicated with like the GameCube and other consoles. PlayStation 2 did it, that sort of thing. And obviously, went later on, of course, the PSP did it. But it was something that, that there was something uniquely Japan that Sony put on there. And that was the Pocket Station, which is basically a memory card that was also a Tamagotchi. I know what you're saying. The Dreamcast VMU kind of reminds you of that. You're absolutely right. The Dreamcast VMU had that. Sony's Pocket Station had it first. The only difference is they never brought it to the United States because it was just too popular in Japan. They didn't have enough parts to make a United States release. They had to keep making them for the Japanese audience. I was so mad when they never released that here because there were re-releases of like Metal Gear Solid that supported the Pocket Station, allowed you to have like a ninja suit, basically. What a shame. What a shame to not have that. But basically, with the Pocket Station, or even with the VMU, like I said, it allowed a person to plug in their Pocket Station instead of a memory card. They could save their game data when they couldn't play at home anymore or wherever they were. But instead of taking their memory card, they would take the Pocket Station with them. And then they could continue to check on their progress and update their progress on the Pocket Station itself. That was, imagine, like I said, for everybody nowadays, it's like, wow, I could do that already or whatever. We'll get into that. But that was, as far as I know, the ancestor of everything we take for granted now. Nowadays, they've been trying to replicate that, at least for the past, I would say, almost 13, 14 years. I remember when Microsoft made the announcement of like Live Anywhere. And the idea is that they were going to have an Xbox application. And you could sign into your game on your Xbox 360 at the time, or your PC, because they were thinking about having crossplay between 360 and PC even back then. Didn't work, but they were thinking about it. And they tried it. And they said, like, well, what if you could, like, play a racing game on, like, either your console or your PC? And then you couldn't be at your game anymore. But you had your phone and you had your account signed in, and you had the application on your phone. You could create a new car from your phone or customize your existing car from your phone. That was like mind-blowing. That was like a mind-blowing idea. Unfortunately, at the time, it never really took off. That was another false start. But half a decade earlier, Sony was already doing something like that with something as simple as a Tamagotchi screen. And of course, later on, you have the step counters with the Pokey. Nowadays, I think there were the Pokey Walkers. Nintendo went away with the Pokey Walkers, where you could just simply put your game down, save a Pokemon specifically to your Pokewalker and then just take that on the go. And of course, that's replicated even further when you had the Pokeball Plus, where you could just simply take Pokemon from Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee, or Sword and Shield even. You could download those to your Pokeball Plus and then use them in like Pokemon Go. That's where it started. That's where it was, and that's where it went. Of course, a lot of that idea is kind of useless because, of course, the Nintendo Switch allowed for the ability to pick it up and just take it with you. But that was, I thought, a really cool idea. That was like just a really cool thing. And the last idea that I saw was something else that Nintendo had done way earlier than I expected. And a lot of people who remember playing Pokemon Crystal, or the Japanese version specifically of Pokemon Crystal, probably remember this. Cell phones really started becoming a thing. Not smartphones, that was later. But regular, personal cell phones and text messaging and data plans and stuff started becoming a thing around the year 2001, certainly by 2002. Pretty much everybody by 2002 had like a Nokia or an LG phone that they took everywhere with them, and so that they could call their folks after class or something like that, or text their friends whenever, basically. Everybody had one of those. But in Japan, you could do more with them. The carriers in the United States, as far as I'm concerned, never really did too much with their phones until they were forced to do stuff with their phones when the original iPhone came out and took off. And then, of course, you basically had decent web browsers. You had to have decent, you had applications that you can make specifically for the phones and that sort of thing. But until the iPhone came out, the carriers here at least did everything they could to stifle innovation, essentially. But that wasn't the case in other countries. And certainly, as far as I know, wasn't the case in Europe. But specifically in Japan, I thought it was actually kind of cool that they released a cellular modem adapter for the Nintendo Game Boy Color. And what this thing essentially was that it allowed you to, if you had a compatible cellular phone, to plug it into your Game Boy Color so that you could have online functionality, basically, from your cell phone into your Game Boy. Now, as far as I know, it wasn't really used for online multiplayer, although local wireless multiplayer and stuff like that would certainly come later for later adapters and stuff. Nintendo used it for DLC and for limited time events. And now we get those constantly with all kinds of games. Nintendo had done that first. Like back in the day, the major DLC and events were all at the game stores. Come to Toys R Us, we'll give you bring in your copy of Sword of a blue or red or yellow. And if we've got any left, we'll give you a Mew, which you can't get any other way, not including hacking and stuff like that. In Japan, I'm sure they had events like that, of course. But in Japan, it would be like, oh yeah, play Pokemon Crystal, get this adapter, hook it into your cell phone, dial this number at this time, and you'll get a Celebi. It would be until at least 2005 when the Nokia N-Gage came out in the United States, which was a complete failure here. Probably a failure worldwide, mostly known as a failure. Before cellular capabilities were possible with a handheld gaming console of any type in the United States. Now you could argue that, the game, the N-Gage proved that the reason they never released it in the first place in the United States is because it failed. No, it was just the N-Gage just sucked. It has nothing to do with, and they released it wrong. But something like a cell phone adapter, I mean, like I said, everybody had cell phones back then. And a lot of people had Game Boy Colors back then. A simple adapter that you could use, that would have taken off like crazy. That would have been a huge thing. but they never released it in the United States, so we never got to not to use it. So those are just some of my memories for why I envy Japan for the longest time, you know, Japanese history and stuff like that. And the purpose of this video was to kind of set up this next video that I'm working on, where I'm talking about one of my absolute favorite games that unfortunately you guys can't get anymore and is not available anymore anywhere. That I think is just like the poster child, or for me, for like the perfect quintessential game of Japan. And we'll talk about that next time. Until next time, my name is Maniac with GameAccess.net. Take care. Over and out.